Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this second session of our 6 in our program on Florida's Way of Water. Dr. Bob Knight is president of the Howard T. Odum Florida Springs Institute. He is an environmental scientist with over 38 years as a Florida aquatic and wetland ecologist. In that time, he has conducted assessments of the ecological health of Silver Springs, east of Ocala, and developed the basis for setting pollutant load reduction goals and water resource values for the Wekiva River and Rock Springs Run. Very familiar water bodies to Pat Harden and to me. He has also made a comparison study of the ecology of 12 of the Florida's first magnitude artesian springs. Since Dr. Knight founded the Florida Springs Institute in 2010, the 501c3 organization has developed restoration plans for 12 first magnitude springs and recently published a report on the ecological health and restoration needs for all of Florida's over 1,000 artesian springs. The goal of the Florida Springs Institute is to document these beautiful and life-sustaining springs and to educate the public about the threats to the springs and to the Floridan aquifer that supports them and most human water use in the state. So please welcome Dr. Bob Knight.
Thank you, Phyllis, for that introduction. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, stay as close to your mic as you can, Dr. Knight.
Okay, I'll stay here close to the computer. So I'm going to speak today about the Florida Springs as a window into our aquifer, our drinking water. I watched Jim Gross's presentation last week, and he gave a good introduction to the Florida aquifer, where it is and what it's like, what it consists of. Just one of the miracles, many miracles of that aquifer, but one is the fact that it has so much flow, so much water recharging it, that it has created over 1,000 springs in Florida, the largest concentration that we know in the world. So let me just try to advance the slide here, and it's not advancing, so I'm going to figure out what's wrong. There it is. Okay, just a little bit more background about me. I've written several books about springs. Silent Springs was the first, back in 2015. Death by 1,000 Cuts, which is encapsulates close to 100 op-eds I've written in the Gainesville Sun and other newspapers around Florida and the United States. My most recent book about springs was Saving Florida Springs. The cover is illustrated here. And then I've just recently written a book about the Santa Fe River and its springs, which is our closest set of really large springs in Florida. A very important set of springs, about a billion gallons a day of groundwater issuing from those springs. My degrees are from Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, in zoology and environmental chemistry and biology and public health, and my PhD is in systems ecology from the University of Florida. I now am the president of the Florida Springs Institute. We have a new location. It's in High Springs on Main Street. This is what we're calling the Florida Springs Welcome Center. It's a beautiful building, a very historic building. If you look at the picture, you can see there's a manatee skeleton on the right. And so we have an interpretive area about springs, and we have a small shop to buy springs-related items if you're going out to recreate in the springs. We have a meeting room where we give presentations and movies and things like that. And then we have our offices here, our lab for our staff who go out and regularly monitor the health of Florida Springs. We picked up the mantra of one of our previous presidents, let's make our springs great again. This reflects on what we really intend to do. It's our mission to understand what's wrong with the springs, what's affecting them negatively, to understand and report on their health, and to develop and promote a really wise management actions that can bring our springs back. No political orientation meant here. As Jim Gross showed you, the Florida aquifer is a very large limestone aquifer. It's demarcated on the north by this red line, which is the fall line in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where the Piedmont falls into the coastal plain. And that coastal plain is underlain by from 0 to thousands of feet of limestone. In fact, the limestone extends way out into the Gulf of Mexico, where it's completely filled with the voids in the limestone are completely filled with salt water. But Florida and the upland portions of this aquifer are filled with fresh water for the most part. The fresh water, though, it floats over the denser salt water that's in the lower part of the aquifer. The whole aquifer is very vulnerable to saltwater intrusion because of the way it's constructed. This is what it looks like. I don't have a video. Philip was hoping I would be able to put a video in. I tried, I failed. But this is what it looks like inside the aquifer. These are passageways that are beyond belief. I think we're all very lucky that we don't have to go swim into here. It's beautiful, but you turn the lights out, and it's the scariest place in the world. You can't live for more than a minute or two in here without oxygen. And it's tight in some places. It's hard to get through. Other places it's vast, where they use scooters to move miles at a time. They've mapped probably over 100 miles of the Florida aquifer, 100 miles underwater that these cave divers have risked their lives to do, giving us a lot of information about where the aquifer actually is, where the water is, and the quality of the water. And a spring is nothing more than a place where that groundwater comes to the land surface. That's the definition of a spring. These are artesian springs, which means the groundwater is actually under pressure because of where it's recharged the aquifer. Some of those areas are much higher elevation than where the springs are. The springs are generally at the lower elevation. And all they are really is a hole in the limestone, a sinkhole. At one time, these springs were dry. Not that long ago, about 30,000 years ago, these springs were dry and were not gushing water for groundwater for them. But as climate changes and sea levels rise, the aquifer is sort of at its maximum right now in terms of recharge and discharge. This is what it looks like. This is Gilchrist Blue Spring, a spring that's known to many of you. Just a second. Okay. Are you hearing me all right there, please? Anybody? Okay, I'll assume you are. Thanks, Bob. This is a map of where the springs are in Florida, the artesian springs, and they pretty much are above I-4. They're north of I-4. There are a few springs still existing in southern Florida. Warm Mineral Springs in Sarasota County and Little Salt Springs are two famous ones. But for the most part, the vast majority of our artesian springs are north of I-4, which is a line, describes the line between Tampa and Orlando. And the springs are along rivers for the most part. Those are the lowest parts of the landscape. And so that's where there are holes in the limestone that allow the escape of that groundwater. And as long as the groundwater is receiving inflows from rain and recharge, then there's got to be outflows. What goes in must come out, and where it comes out is these springs. These springs are the natural discharge point for the Florida aquifer. The Florida aquifer is very different now, as I'll describe, but this was the only way that water came out of the aquifer in the past. And we're talking about a lot of water, about 15 billion gallons a day total is the average amount of flow that comes out of the aquifer. So we have some of the largest springs in the world in this congregation of springs. In fact, we think we have the largest spring, Silver Spring, which I'm sure many of you have seen, has a reputation of having the highest long-term spring flow of any spring in the world in the United States. That's quite a record. There are many large springs in Europe. There are many large springs in Western United States and Northern United States, Missouri and Pennsylvania. But we have more and larger ones than anywhere else. And Silver was probably the king of all the springs at one time. So why are springs important? Well, springs are just unique. I mean, they're unique. If you've been to them, you've seen them. The fact you can look underwater and see life, you can see the plants, you can see the fish, you can see the clear color, the blue water color from the clear water. It's a miracle, and they are like coral reefs in terms of their beauty and their diversity of plants and animals. And in freshwater, they're really the only systems that are like that in Florida. Up in Minnesota and Canada, you have lakes that are crystal clear, but they have very little plant life and animal life in them. In Florida, we have these springs that have enough nutrients and higher sunlight that they're just dynamos for biological productivity. And so a healthy spring looks like this. This is what a healthy spring looks like. Unfortunately, I'll show you some pictures of unhealthy springs. This is in Rainbow River. And the Rainbow River is not completely healthy. It has a nutrient problem for sure, but it is a healthy spring in terms of the biotic environment that's in it. Springs have the ability to support plant and animal life above the water too. And this is just a picture of the Ichetucknee. This is actually wild rice growing in the Ichetucknee River with a great egret preying on frogs and fish around this wild rice. The wild rice harbors enormous flocks of wood ducks. During the fall, the wood ducks come in and harvest the rice the way that American Indians did up in Minnesota from their canoes. It goes crazy out there with wood ducks. The Ichetucknee River is quite a healthy spring system and heavily vegetated, lots of productivity. Other springs that don't have as much plant life in them also can have a lot of wildlife in them because of the temperature of the water. The fact that the water is roughly 70 degrees, 72 degrees year round, the constancy is very valuable to fish like these striped bass. These striped bass in the summertime leave the St. Johns River because it's too warm for them, and they come into Silver Glen Springs. And this chimney here, that's the side spring at Silver Glen, and they come in by the thousands, and they don't eat. They just come in to cool down. This is a life-giving adaptation for these oceanic fish. Other animals are the opposite spectrum. If it wasn't for these springs that were 70 degrees in wintertime or higher, we would not have manatees as regular visitors to North Florida. The only reason manatees were existing in Florida year-round at the turn of the century was because we had these springs. The springs were their only refuge during cold weather. They cannot withstand temperatures in our rivers and our estuaries during the wintertime. They have to be above 68 degrees, and the springs are the only water bodies that have that. So we're blessed with these animals because of the springs. People have long recognized the value of these springs. This is just some of the archaeological record from Silver Springs, ancient Paleolithic points indicating that people were here as much as 20,000 years ago and more, and a mastodon tooth. And these weapons, like the projectile on the right, were actually used, and we have evidence of that for killing these megafauna that were here when humans first showed up in Florida roughly 30,000 years ago. And since then, humans have continued to thrive on the springs. The St. Johns River and Silver River, the Ocklawaha River and the Silver River that are interconnected, connect to the ocean. And the way travelers got to the center of Florida early on, if they couldn't ride a horse, there weren't many stagecoaches, and before the railroads, it was river boats, and they came up these rivers right to Silver Springs, and that's where they traded for the products that were being produced in Central Florida. This is actually at Silver Springs. Some of these cypress trees are still here and still the same ones at Silver Springs. They've been there a long time, but there have been hotels. There have been so many different buildings at Silver Springs. It's got such a long cultural history. And the springs are a window into the aquifer. They allow us to look into the Floridan aquifer. So why is that important? Well, it just turns out the Floridan aquifer is our primary water supply north of I-4. It is the source of close to 99% of all the water that people use north of I-4. About 10 million people are relying on this water supply. And that's not a small thing. Imagine if you had to desalinate about 10 million people. What's that come out? Comes to about 1.5 billion gallons a day of water. The price is enormous, and we get this for free because of the miracle of the Floridan aquifer and the springs. And our cave divers let us know what's going on down there. In addition to all those things, the springs are so popular for recreation. More and more people are visiting the springs every year. I don't think anybody ever saw kayaks in Florida 20 years ago. Everybody's got one now, or an inner tube. Billions of dollars are being spent every year just recreating in these springs. So how did this get me into the Springs Institute? Well, I visited Silver Springs in 1953 with my grandparents for the first time. I saw this miracle of clear water, and that, I don't know if that directed me in my academic career, but I came into aquatic ecology and did my doctoral research at Silver Springs in 1978 to 1980 under Howard Odom at the University of Florida, who had first studied Silver Springs in the 1950s. I then, in my career as an environmental consultant, I served as the expert for most of the water management districts on springs work. And I studied Volusia Blue Springs, 50 years retrospective study of Silver Springs, Wekiva and Rock Springs pollutant load reduction goals, many springs for the other water management districts, and led the Wakulla Springs Working Group for a year. I taught springs ecology at the University of Florida, and I've been directing the Springs Institute ever since. And so this is what I'm doing in my retirement. You're learning in retirement. I'm volunteering in retirement. It's my lifetime now is to do something to help these springs that I appreciate so much and realize they have such a high importance for humanity and nature. Of course, Dr. Odom was my professor. This is a picture of him at Silver Springs when I was doing my doctoral research. He started all the springs work when he first moved to Florida in 1950 as a young faculty member at the University of Florida. He came back in 1970 after a very long and productive career to finish his career at the University of Florida. And he's been gone since 2002, but he's long remembered, one of the most famous scientists actually in the world, inventing many more things in spring science. This is a sketch from a colleague of his of Silver Springs at that time. I just put it in as an illustration, once again, of what a living spring, a healthy spring looks like. It's a spring that's dominated by native plants that have very high productivity. There's good algae growing on these plants that's producing about 2/3 of the food. That's creating a food chain of just millions of organisms, a very diverse food chain, which then translates into the aesthetic enjoyment that humans get for springs. My second mentor in springs is Jim Stevenson. Jim is really the father of springs protection. Jim worked for the Florida Park Service for over 30 years and was their chief naturalist and eventually their head planner. And he was very instrumental in getting many of our major springs in state parks. And so we have about 16 major springs that are in state parks. He's the one that convinced Governor Jeb Bush to start the Florida Springs Initiative and the Florida Springs Task Force. And it was because Jim, long before me, almost 10 years before I was noticing it, was because I wasn't working in springs for a long time, but he noticed that springs were going downhill and he did something about it. He established the Ichetucknee and Wakulla Springs working groups. He's been educating ever since. He's on our board of directors, and he continues his tireless work to protect and restore our springs. And so when I started the springs, it started applying my scientific expertise to what was needed to protect the springs. I had been doing 10 years of research already, proving to me that the springs were in serious trouble. And so I started developing restoration plans. And these are just two of the many restoration plans. They're all on our website. There's long, full copies that have all the background information. There's short summaries that you can print, or you can come by the Florida Springs Welcome Center and get copies for free. But one of the lessons that Odom taught me and taught everybody, I hope, is that a long history of permanency is, of course, no guarantee of a future. And at the time, we thought springs were forever. Springs were the most constant environment in Florida. They had constant flow, they had constant temperature, they had constant chemistry, they had constant sunlight. They were the most constant aquatic environment you could research. But Odom already recognized in the 1950s that springs could be dried up by excessive pumping and pollution. And that had already happened at Kissington Springs. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. I mean, this is I'm not studying springs just to enjoy them anymore. I'm studying springs to try to give them a future. The two biggest problems with our springs are that we're pumping groundwater, the same groundwater that is feeding our springs. That's the same water we use. Remember, we've got 10 million people operating off the same portion of the aquifer that feeds Florida's 1,000+ springs. And because of that, our spring flows are declining. They've declined by over a third on average, and on short term, on dry years, much more than that. And this is why we have a government that is out of control in terms of issuing water use permits. These are center pivot irrigation systems, quarter-mile center pivot irrigation systems. This is one permit. 40 center pivot irrigation systems. It's called the Southern Cross Dairy now. It used to be Swanee Farms. These buildings down in the lower right-hand corner, those are barns for cows, about 1,000 cows per barn. So there's a little bit of water being used here and a little bit of pollution being produced. And this is just typical of what we've done. And what happens when you are pumping a lot of water from the ground near a spring? Well, you know, White Springs, its history was a very popular tourist attraction up until the 1920s. By the 1970s, it was dry. And so this is just visual evidence of what happens when you pump near a spring. There's a phosphate mine right next to this that had a permit, I believe at the time, of over 50 million gallons a day of groundwater extraction. And they're using a lot less now, but Jacksonville is extracting now over 90 million gallons a day of groundwater. Gainesville is close to 20 million gallons a day. And the combined effect is keeping this spring from flowing on a regular basis. Okay, the other big problem with springs is pollution. The springs are receiving their water from the Florida aquifer. The Florida aquifer is limestone. In portions, that limestone is not protected by natural soil strata. It is just covered with sand. And so in those areas, if you apply nutrients to the surface of the ground in the form of waste or fertilizer, a portion of those nutrients makes it into the groundwater. And this is what happens when there are elevated nutrients in the ground. This picture on the right is Silver Spring. Silver Spring, head spring, is full of algae from very high nutrient levels. And then the picture on the left is Manatee Springs. Manatee Springs has no natural vegetation in it anymore. All it has is the most unbelievable growth of filamentous algae that you've ever seen. This algae is not palatable to organisms. It indicates productivity, but it's bad productivity. It's what I call the bad algae. This is just John Moran's picture showing the interconnectedness of our agriculture and our aquifer. One is just right over the other. I mean, we're talking literally maybe 20 to 50 feet from the ground surface where we're applying these wastes and these fertilizers and other chemicals, and the water that some of that ends up in. And these are the biggest sources. We've quantified the sources of nutrients. It's very well quantified. We don't need any more study of it. We just need to stop it. And spray fields. Florida came up with this great idea about 50 years ago that we should direct all our wastewaters to the groundwater because our surface waters were being polluted by our wastewater. And so the state had a program starting with the city of Tallahassee to take all the wastewaters and direct them to the groundwater through what they call spray fields or rapid infiltration basins. And so that's where our wastewater goes now. Most of it goes to our groundwater with incomplete treatment. Now, below that, you see on-site waste disposal. That's septic tanks. Florida has been living on the cheap for as long as developers have had their way, which is since time began in Florida. If you put in septic tanks, it's cheaper than putting in a central wastewater treatment system. And septic tanks provide no treatment. The nitrogen that goes into a septic tank comes out of a septic tank. It is not destroyed in the process. And a portion of that makes it down into the aquifer and the water table. It's a pretty large portion. We have about 2.5 million septic tanks in Florida. And the crazy thing is our state is still allowing people to put more of them in. It's absolutely the definition of insanity. We already know that it costs $20,000 to $30,000 per septic tank to replace them with a central sewer. And yet we're still allowing people to put more in. And then we have confined animal feeding operations. I told you about 1,000 cows in a barn. Cows and dairies are the biggest animal waste source to the aquifer in Florida. They are incredibly dense populations of cows. Each cow is equivalent to about 10 to 15 people in terms of the waste it generates. That waste goes directly on the ground in most cases and goes into the aquifer if you're in a karst confined area. And then we have fertilizer. We're putting close to 400 million pounds of nitrogen on the ground as fertilizer just in the Springs region every year. 400 million pounds, and about 40 million pounds of that is ending up in our drinking water. And this is what's happened to our drinking water. This is a map showing the levels of nitrate, nitrogen in the Florida aquifer throughout the state of Florida. The karst areas where the springs are these brightest areas. These are the areas of most contamination because there's least confinement of the aquifer in these areas and a lot of fertilizer. Fertilizer is the biggest source of nitrogen. Wastewater comes in second. The fertilizer and animal waste together are definitely the biggest source, a very large source. And these, you see our springs are in the same place where the high nitrate levels are. These are nitrate levels 20 to 100 times higher than natural background in the aquifer. And they're way above levels that are problematic. The level of nitrate that is considered safe for springs is down 0.35 parts per million. That's in the green on this figure. And you can see that there are very large areas, about a third of the state actually is contaminated above that. So about 80% of our springs are contaminated. And I talked about our drinking water. You know, we're looking into our drinking water, right? And so we've got these wonderful companies that come to us and get one of these permits to pump down the springs, and Zephyr Hills being one of them, or it was Zephyr Hills, you know, it was Nestle, Blue Triton now. And they get a permit to pump out our water and sell it back to us at about 1,000 to 10,000 times the cost that it costs them to extract it from the aquifer. And they don't pay anything for the water to the state or to us. We do that. Well, the water they're selling us back is springs water that is so, I mean, I've met so many people in my presentation who say, yeah, that's the only thing I drink. Well, I show them this figure here of the nitrate level in our springs water. And the ones on the left, the bars on our left, are all bottled water, bottled springs water. And like I said, all the springs are contaminated with nitrate. So every one of those bottled springs waters is contaminated with nitrate. And Zephyr Hills is the highest. I'm sorry about the misspelling on Zephyr Hills there, but it has the highest nitrate level of any, and it comes from a spring down in Hillsborough County. Our drinking water, otherwise, our municipal drinking waters can be low. If you live in Gainesville, the Murphy well field is protected by 70 to 100 feet of confining layer. High Springs is even certain amount of protection, but as you move west into the karst area, you're seeing higher and higher nitrate levels in the drinking water for our municipality. In other words, almost everybody's drinking this. If you don't live in the areas east of Gainesville, you're nitrate levels that are very elevated. The background is 0.05, 20 times less than these values. 20 times less is what you should be drinking. And if you're in Gainesville, that is what you're drinking for nitrate. But Zephyr Hills takes the award for false advertising for the value of spring water. Okay, there are a few other problems with our springs too. One you've been hearing a lot about is the Ocklawaha River, the dam on the Ocklawaha River from the crazy cross-Florida barge canal. 1967, that dam was closed. I did my research on Silver Springs in 1978, a decade later. Dr. Odom had me restudy Silver Springs because he'd been noticing that the fish populations had declined seriously in Silver River. And my research documented that there was over a 60% decline in fish population. There was an increase in algae in the river. And not only that, the whole populations had changed. The species diversity had changed because the catadromous and anadromous fish that moved between freshwater and saltwater using the Ocklawaha River and the St. Johns River could no longer make the trip safely. And the manatees couldn't get into the spring hardly at all. Occasionally, some would get in through the lock. Ones were killed in the lock. So a travesty. And yet it's still not been removed after 50 years. This stupid dam is still there, waiting to fail, doing nothing but environmental harm, satisfying a few fishermen, but a very small number. And the evidence is that the economy of the area will be lifted and the fishing will be improved by removing the dam and by removing artificial reservoir. And we know it'll restore about 20,000 acres of bottomland forest, hardwood forest, and it'll restore 20 springs, the lost springs of the Agua Baja. So and what this looks like is here. Here you got the Silver River, two pictures that John Moran took, one in 1990, one in 2013. In 2012, the flow in the Silver River was down to about 1/3 of its average historic flow. Largest spring in the world. No longer is the Silver River have the highest flow of the springs in Florida. The Rainbow has the highest flow now. The Silver is not what it was in the past. And then look at Wakulla, that's one of the biggest springs in Florida, one of the biggest springs in the world. This is what it looked like in the 60s. That's what it looked like in 2013. Dominated by algae, lost most of its natural vegetation, and still not restored, even though the city of Tallahassee spent $200 million on an upgrade to their wastewater treatment plant. These are the problems in the springs that we've been seeing, that Jim Stevenson and many other people have been seeing. But these aren't new. These are the same problems we have in South Florida. Look in the St. Johns River at the algal blooms in the St. Johns River. Look at the algal blooms in the St. Lucie River, the Caloosahatchee River, Florida Bay. We are killing the waters of Florida by the same problems, by changing the amount of flow and by polluting the remaining water. And so the problems are from North Florida to South Florida. And this is one of those illustrations of the problem. Guacamole, algae, oh God, this couldn't happen in North Florida. This is the Santa Fe River in 2012 when it stopped flowing. The springs in the upper Santa Fe River completely stopped flowing in 2012 during the drought. This will happen again. We haven't had another drought like this since then, but this is going to happen again. And there's no reason why this will change. The nitrogen levels in the Santa Fe River are still increasing, in spite of the fact that we've had a basin management action plan since 2015 to solve the problem. The nitrogen levels are still increasing, not just at the springs in the Santa Fe River, but the springs throughout North Florida. So the issues are that we need to reduce our groundwater use, and we can easily do that. Florida is blessed by incredibly high rainfall, about 150 billion gallons a day of rainfall coming into Florida. We can easily switch all our outside irrigation rainfall, which would take care of 1/4 of the pumping problem, and a lot of our inside use of water by water catchment from cisterns. We have elevated groundwater nitrate levels because we have no control on how much pollution people are putting into the water. There is no effort by the state, no meaningful effort by the state to control the amount of nitrogen that's going in the Florida aquifer. These basin management action plans are toothless. They've been challenged. They're baseless. The best management practices are baseless. They're unproven. The only thing that's been proven is that they don't work. So the state is not doing anything meaningful to address these problems. And then you have man-made structures like the Rodman Dam, which are just adding insult to injury. They're a very affordable solution. This doesn't have to be an expensive Everglades cleanup. $20 billion cleaning up the mess we made in the Everglades. 20 billion so far, and they're not done. We don't have to spend that up here. We just need to take a couple of strong measures that will only impact about 30,000 corporations. They're not going to impact the 10 million people that live in North Florida. It's the corporations that are profiting off of free groundwater and free right to pollute the aquifer. We need to put a cap and fee on the groundwater withdrawals. We need to put a cap and fee on all the nitrogen loading that we're putting into the aquifer. And we need to use that money to buy out the farms, compensate the people that have, through no fault of their own, done what the state said was legal, and turn things back to a healthy aquifer and healthy springs. We need spring-friendly yards. Like I said, 1/4 of the water quantity problem is from using groundwater to water grass. This is absurd. This is stupid. Why don't we shoot ourselves in the foot? We need to get these confined animal feeding operations out. We found a spring on the Santa Fe River that had 60 parts per million of nitrate. A spring, 60 parts per million of nitrate. And all you had to do was go up 100 feet in the air with a drone, and there's a dairy next to it. And when we had a meeting with the DEP about that dairy, and the owners of the dairy saying this is an emergency. People are drinking that water. That water is above any kind of safe level for nitrate. We were told that they're doing everything that they can do. And I said to the owner of the dairy, I said, you've got to do this as an emergency. You need to reduce the number of cows on your dairy immediately. She said, we'll never do that. So there are other solutions for the wastewater, and we know treatment wetlands work. This is a book that I authored years ago, but you know the Sweetwater wetland that lives so close to it. That is what every community should be doing. I was disgusted yesterday when I drove through Alachua, took the back road through Alachua over to 241, and they're still spraying their effluent out on uplands. That's partially treated effluent being sprayed on uplands, which means it's putting excess nitrogen into the groundwater, and they're wasting a lot of that water through evaporation. They should build a treatment wetland in Alachua. Lake City did it. High Springs is going to do it. Archer's talking about doing it. Newberry may do it, and yet Alachua still hasn't done it, although we recommended it to them a decade ago. But Gainesville is doing it, so thank God. And there's a new treatment wetland coming in Gainesville on Parker Road. Solutions that won't work. I recently made a presentation to the select committee of the Florida legislature on these water issues. And they've spent $400 million of our taxpayer dollars to protect springs. $400 million. During the Springs Initiative, they spent $20 million over a period of 10 years, and they got a lot of things actually done. Of this $400 million, there's probably less than $20 million that actually is accomplished. If we had $400 million to actually spend on fixes, things that would actually fix the problems that I just listed, we'd be a long ways home. We could fix the Ichetuckney system completely for half that. And we could take on these big ones like Silver and Rainbow for those kind of dollars. But the state is not doing that. They're believing fiction. They're putting up smoke and mirrors with these basic management action plans. Okay, so we need to reduce the large groundwater pumping permits. Every pumping permit, there's about 30,000 of the large ones, over 100,000 gallons a day. Every one of those should be cut in half immediately, including the cities like Gainesville. That water is being wasted because it's free. We need to allocate the Springs Protection Funding to land acquisition the way Amendment 1 called for. We need to upgrade our wastewater system so that none of them are contaminating our aquifer. This is one of the easiest places to start. We got to stop putting in new septic systems on small properties. They're still putting septic systems out on properties of just a few acres. And we need to free the Ocklawaha River. So there's actually only one place this can all happen. It's the legislature. And this is the slide I showed them a few weeks ago. They just sort of laughed and didn't have any questions. It's the legislature that can make these changes. It's the legislature that can put a price on water. It's the legislature that can tell the water management districts to cap the amount of groundwater that we're pumping. It's the legislature that can force DEP to do basic management action plans that work. But the legislature is not doing this. And it's because we have the wrong legislature. We do not have a legislature in Florida that believes in protecting the environment or protecting the future of the humanity that lives in Florida. So that's what I have to say about that. And we're all going to suffer. The next generation, I've got grandkids here in town. The next generation after that is going to pay for these sins. And they already are. And we're paying for it too, but we don't have to. And this can all be straightened out through wise governance and an active electorate and public. So sorry for the preaching, but that's the way I feel about the Springs. And that's actually the facts on the matter too. So if you want to learn more, please come to our Florida Springs Welcome Center. And we have training events over there. We have the Springs Academy. We're doing an incredible restudy of Silver Springs right now to assess its current health. We're doing a lot of great things that you can help support by becoming a member or a donor. And just come to our website, floridasprings-institute.org, to learn more about the Springs. And I love Okamic. I love a lot of the people that live there. I hope they're on the call today. And I hope you're all doing very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Your dedication and encouragement is inspiring. You've spent your entire career on virtually this issue. Are there other questions in the audience? Alice, hold on, I'm coming.
Thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, Dr. Knight. I'm wondering if there's any record of who on the legislation receives money from the bottling companies.
I have not dug that information out, but I tell you, the bottling companies are all members of the Associated Industries of Florida. And Associated Industries of Florida are the lobbyists for all the bad guys. They're for all the extractive industries, including agriculture and development and industrial uses like bottled water. So if you go there, you might be able to find out. The water bottling is actually a small fraction of the water quantity issue. A single farm permit for a watermelon field can be using as much water as a bottling company. So the water bottling is just sort of the most obvious bad guy out there, but they're all equally bad. And it's I mean, really, if you've got 20 acres west of town and you go in and apply for a permit, you probably get the permit for 100,000 gallons a day of groundwater. So, but anyway, I'm sorry I don't know more specifically.
Richard?
I'm really kind of toyed with here the university position of IFAS, which has turned over perhaps to the cattle raising industry for their sustainability, where they're one of the culprits for nitrogen getting so high and polluting the existing springs. So how do we justify the emphasis upon cattle from IFAS and others, so that we also can protect against the pollutants that they bring? One other quick fact is, if you had a piece of property, you're allowed to drill for water to water your lawn, for example. And that just seems like we don't have anybody protecting the springs and water.
Yes, sir. Those are really good points. I've tried to work with IFAS over the years. They know who butters their bread. There are many good researchers at IFAS. I taught some of them when I was teaching at University of Florida, and very bright young people. But IFAS is supported by the agricultural industry and are the main spokespeople for the Florida Department of Agricultural Services. So it was actually IFAS researchers that found that the BMPs, the best management practices for dairies, poultry farms, and row crop agriculture weren't working. And IFAS has never verified any of their BMPs as actually being helpful for nitrogen removal. That's what we found out when we challenged the Basin Management Action Plan. They can do better than that. They can, and their scientists, when asked the direct question, will definitely give you an honest answer. But the research needs to be, how do we do these crops in a way that is not polluting our drinking water? And if that means not growing those crops or not having the density of cattle that we allow now, then IFAS should be right out in front saying, no, it'd be much smarter to put longleaf pine on these areas, on these really vulnerable areas. And your second issue about the private wells, it's insane. It's insane what's allowed. That's an easy thing to change in the law, that anybody can put a well down. Any one of the 22 million people in Florida can put a well down in the ground and extract groundwater for free. And you can pump up to 100,000 gallons a day, basically, with that well, without even a permit. So it's insane. And what we're doing is we're actually new developments in Gainesville, like Oakmont, my understanding, are putting in private wells so they can avoid the tiered rates that Gainesville has to try to discourage excessive groundwater use. So very good question. There's no good answer to those other than our leaders are failing.
We look at breaking up these functions, things like logistics, things like health policy, things like health IT infrastructure. There are excellent, best in class organizations that do these functions in other places. It's just, they haven't been allowed to do
Sorry, I
it
don't know where
in
that's coming.
transplant because there's been this one
Somebody's radio.
monopoly Frankenstein contract that includes all of these things.
Bob V or Bob Knight, do you have anything running in your background?
I do not. No, that's not here.
We talked about some of that.
I can mute myself just to prove that. I see some people are muted. So it went away.
Okay. So,
Well, we have a question here on Zoom.
okay.
Bob Bernstein, when I muted you, that background noise went away. So I don't know if you have something else running in your background, but if you'd like to ask your question.
Unmute, please. Bob, unmute. Okay, Bob.
Bob, we know the problem in Florida is giant. On a local scale here, Oak Hammock has a contract with Landscaper, and they seem to want to fertilize and water a lot. I mean, the sprinklers were on last night. The stormwater runoff goes across the street to a small detention pond and then down a swale and then to a sinkhole on the property here, back into the aquifer. I have no idea how much treatment is actually, how much effective of a treatment that detention pond serves. It's pretty tiny. What could be done on a local scale here to have a look at our stormwater system?
Well, there are plenty of engineering firms around that could do an assessment of that. They could actually, I know at other places in the city, they've gone and monitored upstream, to a source of stormwater and put in collection devices and stuff so that they can do a good job. I would guess that that's a pretty insignificant amount of additional pollution. But some of it is, if it's going down a sinkhole, ultimately, that means it's going to the Florida aquifer. So whatever's remaining in that stormwater basin is characteristic of probably what is ending up in the aquifer. They could obviously put a well in to detect that, the monitoring well, or you could actually sample the surface water basin and see what it is. And the city of Gainesville has a pretty strong stormwater program, and it wouldn't hurt at all for you to reach out to them, whoever's in charge of that. I'm not sure who it is right now. But just say, look, we're really worried about this, or we're concerned about this. We'd like to do better. And then you could do a before and after thing. We're promoting the idea of springs-friendly yards, and springs-friendly yards are yards that don't use any groundwater for irrigation and don't use any fertilizer. So, that sounds impossible. Well, obviously, you can grow plants that don't need fertilizer. You don't have to be green all year round, and you can capture rainwater. We have so much rain in Florida. If you just put in the facility to capture rain, you can irrigate an awful lot of landscaping. Now that's not the way we develop things in Gainesville, but that could be the way that Oak Hammock moves forward.
Am I on? My recollection, Bob Knight, is that at least in the 80s, it was illegal to discharge stormwater to sinkholes. Is that actually the case? Was I not understanding that correctly?
Well, I don't think you can discharge stormwater directly to sinkholes now. I mean, a lot of surface flows go into sinkholes. We call them swalettes. A lot of our stormwater systems develop sinkholes. For example, the stormwater ponds in front of Hitchcock's and Alachua develop sinkholes, as our treatment wetlands do to a certain extent. The Kanappaw treatment wetlands that we did develop sinkholes. So you can't always avoid the connection between the two, because I think most stormwater ponds do have a proclivity to develop sinkholes if they're out on the karst area. But no, I don't think it's generally legal to consciously discharge a new point source into a sinkhole.
Okay, because the reason I was wondering is because on Oak Hammock property, when there is a very high rainfall, as there was in September of 2004, everything overflows and goes into the sinkhole on the property. So in a sense, we were discharging stormwater.
Well, you know,
Well,
Gainesville, I always love the little factoid that there's about 300 square miles of Gainesville that has no surface outflow, all to the groundwater.
Yeah.
And that, you know, that's why, that's what Payne's Prairie is. That's what the Alachua Sink is. That's what Hogtown Creek is. These all drain the sinkhole. All of Gainesville, all the runoff from Gainesville. So the point is to reduce the nutrients at the source by not using them in the first place. And secondly, to provide whatever natural treatment you can between the source and the ultimate disposal, which is the aquifer.
Richard.
I've been coming to your talks pretty regularly, and I remember that you have a very sympathetic audience right here at Oak Hammock. And in fact, the speech that you, or presentation that you made previously that I can remember was talking about an Oak Hammock footprint. And you volunteered to kind of tell us about how Oak Hammock was doing and what we could really do to improve our footprint. And I'd like to see if you have some comments about that particular initiative.
No, you've got a good memory. Yeah, we talked about an aquifer footprint. We did a project called the Blue Water Audit. The Blue Water Audit was an audit of what was going into and coming out of the Florida aquifer. And it was a major study. We were heavily funded by a private foundation for a 4-year period to quantify the nitrogen load to and the groundwater extraction from the Florida aquifer over the whole Florida Springs region, which is 28 million acres and includes about 400,000 individual properties greater than 5 acres. We did that. We have a website called the Blue Water Audit. On that website, you'll find a determine your own footprint page. We developed that. It's not very satisfactory. We haven't had any money put into additional work on that, and so I don't really have the ability to help do that for you right now. I mean, it's something that could be done if the funding was found. But I think that what we've done there by looking at the question, that would be the first step that maybe one of you could do with some help and direction from Haley Moody or myself from the Springs Institute. And that, I think it would just point you in the right direction. I mean, it's pretty common sense that if you count up how many nutrients are driving into your front entrance road, and just count the trucks and how much they weigh and what they're carrying, and that's being deposited, and then come up with some good estimates of what the attenuation is as those nutrients find their way through the system and ultimately to the aquifer. I'll be glad to talk to you more about it, but I'm sorry I don't have an answer. Should have had it long before now. So thank you for the question.
So Alice has a question.
I just want to give you an unabashed ad that there is a possibility of having lifetime membership in the Florida Water Institute, and people might want to consider that. The last I knew, it was $300, and that's pretty darn reasonable.
Thank you, Alice. Yeah, our membership things are constantly evolving. I think we may have something that you can donate on a regular basis, a recurring donation type thing. We certainly are always interested in bequeathments and things like that. But we have our lifetime membership award rate, our designation now, I think is like 500. But if you go to our website, floridasprings.institute.org, you can see what the membership issues are. I'm just the old scientist, and so my staff takes care of those things, and I don't know all the details. But thank you for that advertisement. We certainly could use support. We're doing an awful lot on a very small amount of funding. I have 4 staff that I have to pay. I volunteer my time, as I'm sure most of you do in your efforts. And so we get a lot done, but we can only do so much, unfortunately, because we're not supported by the state. We're not supported by the university. We're not supported by any corporation. We're supported by people like you and by generous foundations.
And just to what, another question? Oh, Pat Harden.
Hi, Bob.
Pat, good.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Sort of. Question, the Florida Springs Task Force. I know that you work closely with them. Are they having any success at all reaching anyone in Tallahassee?
Now, I'm not sure what you're thinking of. The Florida Springs Task Force was a task force under the Department of Environmental Protection.
I'm sorry, the Florida Springs Council.
Oh,
Ryan
yeah.
Smart
And they're on the phone here, I think. Bob Palmer is on their board of directors. Florida Springs Council is having a lot of effect. They've had one very successful lawsuit related to the BMAPs, and they've really kept Nestle Blue Triton now in the Water Management District on the run in terms of that crazy permit at Jenny Springs. So yes, they're doing a lot. And once again, they are very limited by money. They have very limited resources like we do. They have 2 paid staff, and they do an amazing amount of work. So yeah, Florida Springs Council, they're out there lobbying right now for some potentially helpful legislation this year.
And Ryan Smart from Florida Springs Council will be our speaker on April 11th.
That's
So,
right.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I understand there's a bill working its way through the legislature that would prohibit local governments from imposing or passing any environmental laws that are stricter than the state environmental laws. That could
They're shameless, Philip. They're absolutely shameless. They think they can get away with anything, and so far they have.
Well, any further questions? Well, on that note, thank you very much, Bob. Beautiful photos, beautiful slides, and a very, very informative talk. Thank you.
It's great to see all of you again. Take care. Thank you.